Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me say, I've had the honor for the last 2 or 3 hours to sit here and listen to incredible speeches by your peers. It is an honor because I've been inspired and it's been thought-provoking, and I know that the future of this country and this world is in very good hands. And as I'm about to talk for a minute, we need that inspired and leadership to deal with some of the issues that we're grappling with today. I'm a native South Floridian, born and raised in Miami Beach, and moved back to South Florida 25 years ago with my wife to start a family and raise a family here in this beautiful subtropic environment, an environment that is indeed challenged. And April 1st of 2013, not lost on me, April Fool's Day, I started as city manager of the city of Miami Beach. And not long after that, I know this, nope, no, back, one more. Not long after I started my job, Rolling Stone magazine cover story was that the city and area that I was representing was going to disappear because of sea level rise. And literally overnight, this article by Jeff Goodell, who I've since had the privilege to spend some time with, sparked an industry of folks coming to study South Florida. It made us the poster child facing an existential threat that was very critical. I got involved in local government because, as your first speaker today said, I found my purpose and my passion in local government. And part of the reason was, as one of the other speakers mentioned, with democracy challenged in our nation's capital, it's very alive and well at the local level as we grapple with very difficult issues. Unfortunately, when I took the job, I didn't realize the future was that issue. But we turned it around. It wasn't about goodbye Miami. It was about how do we say hello Miami Beach, a 7-mile barrier island, literally floating on a limestone sponge, you might say. And when I got, don't turn, I'm sorry, go back. I forget. The top picture is an area named Sunset Harbor. You see the blue skies. This was flooding on what we called it sunny day flooding, because literally because of sea level rise during king tides, our streets were flooded with water. Fast forward 4 years later, that same neighborhood, that same corner on one of those king tides had no water in the streets. So like one of your speakers talked about, we have no limits. There is an ability to change that future. Sunset Harbor, again, one of those examples of the flooding. Indian Creek, this is a state road that it would flow over the seawalls, up our pipes and up through the ground. Other areas in the city. So this was a real challenge to us. And so we dove into how climate change was impacting us, not by arguing, as one of the speakers earlier, about how we have to be Generation Blue, because obviously we do, but with our focus is we've got to deal with the consequences of it today. This is just a quick drawing of what the kind of things we've had to do with better drainage, how we treat that water so we're not contaminating the ocean worse, so we eliminate the large structures, building tall seawalls to stop the water from coming back over, backflow preventers so that it doesn't flow up the pipe. We do have the ability through solid engineering and hopefully through the use of green infrastructure to change our environment. We've also realized, and unfortunately with the light it doesn't look so great, we have to change literally the physics of our city. Our motto is Miami Beach rising above, because, and you can't see it maybe very well, on the right side of that road, it's about 3 feet higher than the left side. We literally, in certain areas, are raising roads 2 or 3 feet so that we're not underwater during those king tides and vehicles. And so I show you a series of before and afters in certain neighborhoods. But lo and behold, about 3 years into my job, this little critter appeared, the Aedes aegypti, a mosquito native to Africa that has somehow made its way around the world. It is a carrier, it's called the yellow fever mosquito. It's a carrier of yellow fever and dengue and chikungunya, and that new 4-letter word that discovered South Florida, Zika, in 2016. Well, Zika was a challenge that arose in tropical areas, but is increasingly arising in even non-tropical areas because of the issue of climate change. Its habitat is now much broader. While 80% of the people who get Zika don't know they have it, those who do know they have it, the most common symptoms are like a flu. But what really made it quite a health scare in this country, for those of you who may or may not have recalled, was that for women who are pregnant and giving birth, the likelihoods of birth defects that are very seriously, including microcephaly, are great. And so during the time that this was impacting any childbearing age woman, or certainly pregnant, it was a real risk to those who lived here. and those who might travel here. And remember, South Florida depends on millions and millions of people who come here annually. They put a big red box on Miami Beach. This was the National Center for Disease Control, and a big red box on Wynwood, warning the country and the world, be careful about going there, particularly if you're a woman of childbearing age or if you're pregnant. It clearly had a very negative impact on our community economically, but also the fear factor was significant. Zika was also unique among mosquito-borne diseases because it's also sexually transmittable. So for the first time you had a mosquito-borne disease that was sexually transmittable, and remember I mentioned that 80% of the people who have it don't know they have it. And so what happens, obviously, in that situation? One of the reasons why I say Zika was so tied to climate change was not only because, obviously, the habitat spreads, but there are three critical factors that happen. Now, these mosquitoes don't carry the disease naturally. What happens is the mosquito bites somebody who has, whether it's dengue or chikungunya or Zika, and then transmits that disease to a person then they bite afterwards. When that mosquito, when she bites someone, and I say she, because in fact what we found with the Aedes aegypti, it's the female mosquito that bites, not the male mosquito, they then carried over. Three things happen with climate, with the global warming that actually make this a more serious issue. Number one, heat makes the mosquitoes hungrier, so they bite more. Number two, heat actually shortens their gestation period, so they breed more rapidly and create more offspring who can then come out and bite. And three, very interestingly, the heat actually means that from the time they bite someone who has it to the time they then become contagious is significantly shortened. So this was another perfect example of how climate change, we think so much in South Florida about sea level rise and the challenge of water, but this was another example of how climate change creates new environments, new shocks, and what actually have become sort of new stresses. Now, one of the other, in dealing with Zika, obviously you're dealing with insects, so folks think about, we've got to deal with insecticides, we've got to drain water, we've got a larvicide to kill the children, or to kill the eggs, but also, ultimately, both the state and the county decided that the way we had to address this was using some very powerful, nerve toxin pesticides, including a very controversial one called NALED, which in fact has been banned in Europe. So needless to say, now at the local level, we're grappling with looking at how we're going to solve this problem in the short term, and all of a sudden, you see some posters here that say, the cure is worse than the disease. There were people literally who said, do not spray NALED. That is going to do worse things for our community and for our children and for our plants and our animals than the risk from Zika for children who might be born. And there was a very healthy debate about this at the local level, at the county and city. In fact, it was a colorful debate. People showed up at meetings in these kind of outfits, bringing dead animals that they claimed had been killed by nails when it was sprayed. So it was fascinating that public debate. We talk about democracy being challenged at other levels. At the local level, there was a very healthy debate in the community about what should we do in dealing with this, and the rafters were packed with individuals talking about it. We also had to deal with landscaping issues. This is our botanical garden, a beautiful place. You'll notice on the right side of the picture, there's all these beautiful bromeliads. Bromeliads are breeding grounds for mosquitoes, because the Egyptian mosquito is not a swamp mosquito, it's not a mangrove mosquito, it's an urban mosquito. It likes dark areas, small puddles of water, that flower pot in your backyard that you've ignored for years that has some water sitting in it in the dark. They love those kind of scenarios. And bromeliads were a big part of that. In fact, for those who don't know bromeliads, the center of them is literally a little dark area of water. One of the things I did, which wasn't very popular, is I ripped out of every public spot of Miami Beach every bromeliad we had. The botanical garden that I showed you before was one of the first places where there was actually active transmission of Zika because it was full of bromeliads. Interestingly, South Dade, the agricultural area, is one of the leading producers of bromeliads. Didn't make me very popular with the breeders down there of that. But the lessons that we learned from this are really applicable to the climate change issue as a whole. Number one, you got to educate folks. You got to go out and to the community and let them know what's going on. Nobody inherently knows about what Zika is, who the Aedes aegypti mosquito, never heard of it before. This is an example of our mayor, who is very active on social media, a mayor at the time, going to the CDC in Atlanta and learning and then sending back on social media to communicate with our residents. It required a multidisciplinary and multi-agency solution. No one government could deal with these issues. This is a perfect picture I give you. You had Miami-Dade mosquito inspector out there with one of my code compliance officers, checking where sites had been identified, where Zika carrying mosquitoes have been identified. And by the way, putting themselves at risk here. You know, earlier one of your speakers talked about being an ally and not a savior. There is no saviorism in climate change. We're all being impacted by it, and even the people who are helping the community deal with it are exposed to it themselves, and including myself. I remember the day we sprayed NALED. I went out onto Lincoln Road specifically with my employees to let them know, if you're going to be exposed to a pesticide, if a homeless population, well, so am I, and we're going to work through this together. But it did require a level of cooperation at a national, state, county, and local level. Here again, our workers out there. Many of you may be familiar with a thing called the Jersey barrier, which you see all over the streets and construction projects. These are breeding grounds for mosquitoes because you fill them with water, and if you don't treat it. Again, a multidisciplinary approach with how we had to deal with this. So again, it was education and outreach. It was working together, teamwork, not just across departments in a government, but across government entities. It took bold action. Mayor Jimenez ordered the spraying of NALED, and there were a lot of people who were very angry about that. But what ended up happening, in fact, was that through the efforts of the spraying, through the, and you'll see some of the signs, the drain and cover campaign, where we were telling people, drain the water, cover, pour out those pots, through campaigns to protect your home, eliminate or manage all sources of water, even student messaging, messaging to young people about the threats of it. We actually, according to the CDC, were the first community ever to actually break a contagion of this kind of disease. And thankfully, those red boxes have been eliminated. Ultimately, it brings us back to a term that a lot of you hear about, which is resiliency. You know, we had a speaker earlier talk about what are the limits of us as human beings. Resiliency is really talking about what are our limits as a community. Resiliency is that capacity, whether it's an individual, community, a city, to deal with chronic stresses and shocks. Zika was a shock in 2016. We didn't expect it. We had to deal with that immediate emergency. But now we realize that because of climate change, it really is a stress. We are forever going to be living in a temperate environment where mosquito-borne diseases can be part of the issue. So again, whether it's mosquito-borne diseases, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's some of the issues that were identified earlier about the impact on our environment, the whitening of the coral reefs, the whitening of my hair having to deal with these issues. It ultimately, we have come together. Miami Beach and Miami-Dade County formed Resilient Greater Miami and the Beaches, and was selected as one of the 100 Rockefeller resilient cities in the world. But you know, I'm not going to be here in 2050 or 60, well, maybe in 2050, 2060 or 2070. And so when I say I'm inspired by your leadership, you all will be. And the kind of world we become, the kind of resiliency, if you love South Florida, we are ground zero. We are the poster child. But I do believe that we can push our limits, and we can get to a point where by raising our roads, by raising our buildings, by having more resilient codes, by focusing on perhaps countering the effects of global warming, creating more green areas, beautiful dunes on our beaches, we can hopefully have a resilient South Florida for centuries to come. And I know you're in good hands. Thank you.